Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're located. Welcome to the Rencore and Skybow webinar about 10 reasons why you should move away from InfoPath now. I would like to give you a short introduction on who we are.
We could probably do more than 10 reasons, really.
We probably could do more.
We stuck to 10.
Let's, for today, stick with 10.
We only have an hour, so we stuck.
Right. Right. So my name is Erwin van Hunen. I'm a product owner for Rencore. Besides that, I'm pretty active in the SharePoint P&P, Patterns and Practices effort. And you might have seen me speak on the random conference worldwide. And today with me is Mike Fitzmaurice. Mike.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mike Fitzmaurice. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Skybow. I've been active in the SharePoint community since before it was a SharePoint community. In fact, I helped create it. I was the very first technical evangelist for SharePoint way back in the day, and worked at Microsoft for about half of SharePoint's lifespan, the first half. Once upon a time, believe it or not, SharePoint was not cool until we convinced people it was.
Amazing, yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But both of us have done a lot of work with both formal development, professional development, and also low-code, no-code, citizen development. And essentially, we care a lot about making sure that people can do what they want on top of the platform, whether that's in code or whether that's with clicking.
Exactly.
And this is all about, well, actually, we're talking about migrating InfoPath with professional tools. So it's kind of the union of coding and clicking, isn't it?
It is. It is.
Yes.
Before we continue, a little household message here. If my slide deck is willing to go to the next. There we go. If you have questions during this webinar, you're very welcome to ask them. Please use the Q&A functionality. Notice that there is a chat and there's a Q&A in Zoom, which we're using today. Please use the Q&A because that will help us to organize the questions a bit easier. There also will be recorded the questions together with the whole webinar. So after this webinar, you will receive a link from us, an email from us, where the link to where you can download this webinar and view it again if you want to.
Yeah, so type the questions and type them liberally. And in fact, if you ask a very quick question with a very specific answer, and we actually have friends of ours monitoring it. So if it's a question we think everyone will want to see, we'll wait till the end and Erwin and I we'll answer it then.
Yep.
But if it's a very tactical, person-specific question, especially if it's a question about this webinar, someone will answer it right away. But we need you to type in there because we're only monitoring the Q&A functionality, not the chat window.
Correct, correct. So let's get started here. And my mouse is actually not cooperating today for some weird reason. There we go, there we go. So InfoPath is
yeah, old. we said 10 reasons, so this is number 1.
This is Ron.
Yeah.
InfoPath is a very old product. It's been around for quite some time.
I remember when the Office team built it.
Wow.
There at the time, yeah. It was really, what was it first called? NetDocs, or can't remember the original code name for it, but the point was it was designed in it wasn't designed in 2003. Erwin, I apologize. I wrote this bullet. It was released in 2003. It was designed 2 years more prior to that.
Right.
And we built it, if you would click, we actually designed it to work with BizTalk server, which was catching on at the time. We had the Office and the e-business servers division were 2 different divisions, but we were friends. We wanted to talk back and forth. So Microsoft had a huge investment in XML, and what we needed was something that would make an XML document look like an Office document.
Right.
That's why InfoPath was created. You might think of it as an electronic forms facility. No, we were trying to make something that would allow you to type in something that felt like a Word document or felt like a spreadsheet, but that one translate immediately to XML so automated processes could pick it up and use it.
I see here
We've
actually
been,
Q&A that someone mentions that Patrick mentions here that it was first called NetDocs and then Info.
it was NetDocs. Okay, good. Thank you, Patrick. I thought it was NetDocs. I just couldn't remember for certain.
Right.
Yeah, it was NetDocs. So, yeah, in practice over the years, the number one use of InfoPath turned out not to be a standalone document on a desktop that would get submitted into some queue service by BizDoc server. It wound up being used by the SharePoint team as the facility to create either form libraries or, even more common than form libraries, custom UI for building forms on lists. So you could call it scope creep, you could call it adaptability, you can call it whatever you want. The point is, it's definitely not a child of the cloud.
Very obviously not, no.
Yeah, it is very rich, very powerful, but even the ability to render InfoPath in web pages was something that was done well after the fact. Look, it's nice. A lot of people have done a lot of good work with it. We're not here to disparage InfoPath. It did a lot of good for a long time. It's still around for a little while, but it's not exactly built to the use case of cloud scaling apps and rapid app development for more than one thing at a time. It was meant to be the form. The form was the thing.
Yep.
So goodness of fit is not the watchword here.
It's like if you take the last bullet there, complex to maintain. I've been a consultant many years. I've worked with InfoPath. Did that make me happy? Not necessarily. I don't know if that was not the, let's say, the happiest part of my job, to work with InfoPath and build solutions based on InfoPath, with InfoPath services, especially on SharePoint. So it is a complex to maintain technology, or if you build forms or solutions with InfoPath, it is a very complex to maintain product and solution. And there are many limitations and things. You started to build all kinds of wonderful XPath queries and all kinds of things that give you just headaches. I don't know about you, but it provided quite some headaches with me.
Yeah, well, you just gave the two most common consultant answers. Not necessarily, and the only one you didn't do is it depends.
Fair. That will come. Don't you worry.
Yes, that will come.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Of course, it's SharePoint after all. We talk in relationship to SharePoint.
Well, this is true. Now, point number two is I'd like to think this should not be a surprise, but because it was announced in 2013, 5 years ago. But it's not impossible that one person, in which case it's good for you to know this. Microsoft said, we're done with InfoPath. The last update was in 2013, and people were gently suggested to stop using it. Now, Microsoft did this because, well, the main reason was InfoPath just didn't scale to the cloud, didn't fit in well with Office 365, had an impact on the overall performance of the service, and just, they had to double down and work on other things. Even though Microsoft is huge, it's not infinitely huge. And so people that worked on InfoPath started working on something else. So the last update was in 2013. Now, no one needed to panic because it's still supported. You file bugs, or if there are huge security holes or something like that, it has official support, but no new features and no new, nothing new is going to happen. But if you have it, you are safe until 2026. But don't, please, please don't think that 2026 is, 8 years away and who cares, it's never going to come. We can just keep going with our legacy InfoPath forms. You're given a lot of time. You're supposed to use it to calmly and carefully think about what you're going to do next.
The fact that, the InfoPath forms itself was rendered on SharePoint, are rendered as HTML. And the HTML that it is using is, you could almost call it deprecated HTML, and that will not change.
Oh, yeah.
So even if your technology and maybe there's some wonderful new HTML6 standard or whatever standard comes out next year, your InfoPath forms will not upgrade. They will still look the same old school design that you made them in. And you can redesign the forms, but the HTML used to render them will still be old school HTML. So there is all kinds of challenges connected to that part of the product. And you can almost compare it with like, yeah, if you really search around well, your Ford Model T will be supported by someone, but that doesn't make it a fast car. It will still run. You can still use it to get from A to B.
Or a non-polluting car.
No, good point. Very good point.
Yeah.
You can still use it as a car, but it won't give you much comfort, and you will not make it. Yeah, it won't be a fast car and non-polluting car. And that's the same a bit with InfoPath. Yes, it will work, but will it work in all the modern scenarios that you will come up with, or that Microsoft comes up with? I don't know. So that has to be careful. Be careful. The world has changed.
That's true. And we kind of made this point in the previous slide. The biggest reason for why InfoPath was deprecated is because we need more in order to make things scale to the cloud. Not so much, well, certainly your form being used by a lot of people in a lot of places. If you deploy something to an Office 365 site in a German data center and you need somebody in Singapore to open it, they're not going to have a good time. InfoPath wasn't designed to emit, to Erwin's point, HTML that it's very chatty. There are lots of round trips. It wasn't meant to think about global issues or global performance or many forms being rendered in many places by many tenants. It's not a cloud product.
No.
And we want that now. We like the idea of multi-tenant. We want a form in one place to be used by everyone on the globe.
Yep. It's not a mobile solution either.
No, it is not. And look, I actually think there's some people that say mobile first or mobile is running the world. I actually think that's a bit hype-like. What I do think is the right way to say that is mobile as equal footing as the web. People are going to use web browsers forever, I think, or at least for a really long time. But if you're not also mobile and allow people to use it either way, you got a problem. And exactly. InfoPath's mobile story is just non-existent.
No. You could actually almost say that it's not necessarily mobile, it's more not handling different screen aspect ratios and resolutions.
Sure,
and all those
because
things.
Mobile web is a thing. In fact, mobile web is cool again.
Yeah. But the browsers nowadays on mobile devices are as competent and as good as the browsers on your desktop. So it's not actually the browser functionality where that used to be in the beginning the case. It's more like, okay, we have a different screen ratio. We have a different environment where we use this form. Maybe you have to be able to tap on things instead of clicking on them with a small mouse button, those kind of stuff. So that makes it, and there's InfoPath never really followed the world there. And as I said in the previous, when we talked about the previous slide, it's not really following web standards anymore. It was you can debate about if it was following them at the time it was released, and we're now talking about the latest ones. InfoPath 2013. You can already debating about that, but it's for sure not doing it right now.
It's essentially interpreting an XML form schema and then emitting HTML from that on the fly. So it's old school HTML, and it's not exact. The form itself is not HTML. The form itself is metadata that gets basically just in time converted into HTML. It's not performant, and again, it's trying to hit a target that's been obsolete for a long time.
Indeed. So, bad practices.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan. I know you are too, about separating the tiers. You've got a user interface tier or front end tier. You've got a back end tier where the data lives. the data access tier, the data tier, depending on what you call it. You've got a middle tier where business logic or business rules or process logic lives. Those are three different places. Usually they're different software components that excel at those three things, and people that are really good at data tend to not be great at user interfaces. Even process people are not necessarily really good at designing UI, and UI people, I really don't want touching anything other than UI.
I'm one of the back-end code guys. I'm not
yeah,
a UI person.
and look, I love UI people. I'm not disparaging them at all. I'm saying it's a skill, and what you do in order to make something highly usable doesn't. Those are neurons that are not being devoted to normalizing data or figuring out where the indexes go or figuring out whether things should happen in parallel or serial or anything like that. You separate the tiers for a reason. InfoPath really, really kind of wanted, it encouraged you if it didn't explicitly want you to put well, certainly the UI is there, but they kind of wanted you to embed the business logic in there. And the fact they were even capable, if you used form libraries, of storing the data in an XML file tightly coupled to that form, which basically meant everything was in one place and everything was being built by the same person. And that's just crazy.
Yeah, especially when you have larger teams. That's a non-working situation, I think.
Yeah.
Esoteric rule syntax, absolutely. It's an art form, I think.
Yeah, and it's very unique to just InfoPath. And the rest of the world, we've kind of moved on to ways to do expressions. We either do them Excel style or we do them JavaScript style, but InfoPath is neither.
No.
And that's an issue.
It's
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so, go ahead. No.
I suspect that we're going to say the exact same thing on this bullet, but you spoke first. Please go.
No, it's like because everything is located in one location. Everything is together. It becomes very easily such an unmaintainable mess where you can't keep track of what happened, who did what. That's that's a question you cannot answer.
The way I like to put it is, Erwin, you build an InfoPath form, and then you go on a vacation or a holiday, depending on where you live. You call it one thing or the other, but you're gone for at least 2 weeks. Well, you're gone. Someone realizes that we have a problem, or the business needs changed, and we, for one reason or another, we need to edit that InfoPath form. And you're on an island, and you don't have your mobile phone with you. So I'm on my own. I have to open up that InfoPath form and crawl inside your head. And I mean this in the nicest possible way, but that's not a pretty place. Or more to the point, I'm sure your head could be a very pretty place, but the part that was used to build that form is not.
Exactly. It's a very worrying place.
and here's, I didn't mean to make anyone think I thought, no, Erwin's a lovely human being, but the part of anyone's head that works on an InfoPath form is going to be cluttered and messy. And in fact, if Erwin comes back from his holiday and opens up his own form, he's going to have trouble crawling back inside his own head.
Absolutely.
It's not a good, it's very hard to make changes.
After any developers here in the call, it's the same, like, you write some code, a year later, you look at the code and you're like, who wrote this? And it's actually yourself, you wrote it. And that's the same experience with InfoPath.
Yeah, I don't know if you're assessing a trend out there, everyone, but we're basically, in the first 5 rules, we're giving you reasons for why you should get off of InfoPath. These are the negative reasons. If you get off InfoPath to avoid the problems we're describing. The final 5 reasons are actually positive reasons. But let's finish the negatives and move on to slide number 5.
Right. Just to make, I see a couple of questions popping up here. We will address your questions. People asking the questions. There's a couple of questions, and we will address them.
Great. Yeah.
Later during the webinar. So difficult to govern. There is no auditing. Who did what, when, how, why? There is no such thing. Basically, there is no version.
Yeah. In fact, well, It's entirely possible, especially if you use a form library approach, to have multiple versions of an InfoPath form circulating around, and it's hard to figure out which one is the right one.
Yep, yep. And because of InfoPath, is the file itself contains both business logic and UI. I'm not aware of any version control system actually that is able to like look at them as separate artifacts. So for any version control
Certainly
system,
not.
it's
Yeah,
just a file. It's just a single file, and that one can be versioned in that version control system.
and it's treated like a blob, so there's no
Exactly.
profiling. There's no ability to. I can't figure out if an InfoPath form has a performance bug or a performance issue or a bottleneck or something to that effect. Profiling is just not a thing, and monitoring its behavior and trying to track it it's not a thing. And if I used web page performance tools, which do exist out there, it doesn't matter because I have no ability to control how an InfoPath form definition is going to render into HTML. So even if I found something weird in the rendered JavaScript, I can't do anything about it.
No, exactly. Now, when it comes to auditing and figuring out what is out there, there's several approaches you can do, and that is the click around approach. You basically navigate to your farm, you go to the site collections, you click around, who is using InfoPath forms and what are they doing? And you download the forms and you check out what is in there, and you will go crazy within a day, probably. And you most likely skip forms, or you don't find them, or you're not aware of them, or you don't see a site collection because you don't have access to them. So there's a lot of wrong
there's
there.
no way to tell by looking at a list if you're using InfoPath forms to render the UI for that list.
No.
You literally have to go to a list, open one list item, and see if an InfoPath form pops up.
Yeah. PowerShell, very handy, obviously, but you need to understand how PowerShell works, how to write a script. And keep in mind that if we're talking on-premise and you run PowerShell on the server, there's all the technology issues with like disposal of objects and memory leaking that can happen with server-side code that applies to PowerShell on the server side too. So you basically have to be a developer to write a good PowerShell script here. And you have to understand the object model of the farm, or if you use Office 365, the tenant. So basically, you need to be able to write code. The fact that you use PowerShell for that, yeah, that's one thing. But
PowerShell scripters are developers. They really don't want to admit this, but they totally
Yes, they are. I agree. You could also write a console application in .NET, but it has the same challenges as PowerShell. With the main difference is that the console application is compiled, so it might run a bit faster. Actually, not that much faster, but it will run a bit faster. But the downside is that if you come into an insight where you have to change something, you will have to find either the developer that wrote it, or you have to recompile that application yourself. So it's just a hassle, basically.
Mm-hmm. And then the forms themselves. I mean, you were talking about auditing a moment ago, which is just trying to figure out where InfoPath is. What we mean here by assessment options is trying to figure out if someone wrote a really bad form. Pretty much requires you to open it one by one in the InfoPath Designer and dig through every rule, every view, every field definition to figure out what's going on. This is explicitly what I was referring to jokingly as crawling inside someone else's head.
Yep, that's what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll miss things.
Yeah, and also keep in mind you need access to the farm.
Oh, right. Good point.
You need to be able to access that farm. So if you're a consultant, you will have to go on site and connect to that farm if it's an on-prem farm, and use the InfoPath Designer. And if you don't have it installed, download that one, install it. And connect to the libraries and to the sites and retrieve those forms and have a look in them. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of work. And you very likely will miss things because of that. So
now come the positive reasons. And the first positive, hopeful thing you should know about is that our friends at Rencore have actually been doing some really good work here.
So as I said in the introduction, I'm the product owner for Transformator. And SharePoint Transformator is a tool that can actually do a lot of the ugly, boring, time-consuming work for you. So what it can do is it can analyze your farm, your on-prem farm, and it will find all InfoPath forms. It will actually find tons of other things more, but in this case, we're talking about pure InfoPath. It will find your InfoPath forms, and it will list them nicely where they are used. But it also allows you to actually look inside the form and see what it uses and how it works and what's behind the scenes without you needing to have InfoPath Designer. It actually allows you to do this offline. The inventory part is something that you run once on your farm. That is a result that comes out of that, and that you can take with you. So if you're a consultant, you go to the customer, you run the inventory, you take the result of the inventory with you, and you have access to those forms. You don't need to actually go back to the farm, be online, connected to your farm, and look around them. And to give you a brief overview of what that looks like and what the product looks like, I will share my screen. I already do that, but share you Transformator. So this is Transformator. And as I said, we analyze many more things, including workflows, content type, usage, etc. But right now, I want to drill down into the InfoPath forms. And here you see all the forms that we discovered and where they are being used, in which site, how many views, any data connections, if there's actually code behind. And if we look at, for instance, this employee registration form, you see here that we have two views, the main view and the thank you view.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have all the fields. You can actually hover over here and see, just like InfoPath Designer, which field is being used here.
Mm-hmm.
We have the data connections here. And even if there's no rules in this case, and there is, we actually have the code behind. So for instance, get the name of a manager here. You can also have a look at the C# code in this case, what is running behind the scenes if someone clicks that button. So this is a very simple way of actually having building up an insight. And it's like, okay, where are all those citizen developers in my organization that happen to have access to InfoPath Designer? Where have they been creating forms? And this is a let's put it like this, a relatively boring form, but we actually render the form in full fidelity. So if the forms have design in there, we will render that design for you too. So and even some drop downs actually work. We've been playing briefly with the idea is like, should we build any replacements for the InfoPath services? But because we have full access to the forms and the rendering, but we decided not to do that. But Transformator discovers all the forms for you and gives you a really nice insight in what is in there, what do they look like, what do they contain, without you going into all kinds of tricks with clicking around in your farm or running obscure PowerShell scripts or console applications. Let me start the presentation again.
Oh, great. Now here's another positive reason. Yeah, people were asking, what do I do instead of InfoPath? And the answers didn't look great 5 years ago, which is why a lot of people continue to use it, even though its days were numbered. But in the meantime, Power Apps have evolved, and they're actually pretty nice, but they live outside of SharePoint. They're rendered externally to SharePoint. They appear, they do a lot of work to surface inside of a SharePoint site and look like it's part of the SharePoint site, but they're external things. They make a connection to SharePoint to get the data, but it's a cloud-based solution, so on-premises is not that viable. At least it's still early. They've been around for almost 2 years.
Yeah,
but the uptake is very gradual, not because people are. It's because IT departments are very cautious, and IT departments have gotten very used to InfoPath, so they're not migrating right away because there is no migration path to them. But yeah, no, Erwin and I both like Power Apps, but Power Apps are not magic, and they're not the answer to every problem. And again, migration matters, and there is no story there.
Nope.
Now, if you're using InfoPath to render SharePoint lists, then PDF forms make no sense at all. But if you are using form libraries where the form is a document, you could start using PDF-based techniques, because Power Apps doesn't attack that use case at all. But yeah, if the purpose of the form is to preserve a document of some sort, a record of what took place, you could use PDF techniques. But that is a completely different approach. The options for data connectivity are a lot more limited. There are some really good products out there that do PDF-based forms, but the odds of it being compatible or comfortable are next to zero. And that won't help you with rendering lists. So it might actually make sense to use this, but it's going to be on a subset of your cases, and the learning curve is going to be, shall we say, non-trivial.
Yep. And to stress that again, it is cloud-based, so it only applies to Office 365. It doesn't apply to on-prem.
Yeah, you might have heard of an on-premises data bridge. That's for accessing data living on premises, but the form is still a cloud thing. It's a cloud form that might be able to reach on-premises data if you do some infrastructure work.
And there's still many customers, people out there that have SharePoint farms running that are completely locked down for the outside world for very good reasons. And this technology doesn't apply, basically.
That's very, very true. So there are other alternatives from the wonderful world of partners. And one, of course, is Skybow. A lot of us have been doing this work for a long time. So there are very well-established, very mature, very well-tested solutions out there that do value-added forms. And many of them are work both on-premises and online. And here's the thing that is particularly nice. Migration is actually becoming an option, because some of the things that Rencore have been doing and some of the things that Skybow have been doing are focused, if we go to the next slide, on making a migration solution really, really work. And it's a three-pronged approach.
Exactly, it's 3 steps. So as what I mentioned earlier already is that Transformator analyzes your farm and abstracts the forms.
Yeah, you actually take, when you abstract away a form, you've got a friendly representation of what are the fields, what were they being used for, what data did they connect to. So in other words, it's a full description of the InfoPath form, but outside of the InfoPath form, right?
Correct.
Excellent.
And that information we send on to our friends at Skybow.
And we transform it into a form of our own.
Exactly.
Because we take the Rencore metadata and we can immediately use that to build a Skybow style, a rich form. And the nice thing about Skybow rich forms are, well, they're fast, they're powerful. We have a ton of features, some of which aren't really in InfoPath without, well, almost what I would call hacking, like tabs, really, really easy for us. Grids, we do editable grids and standard style list views. Erwin, you might just want to start tapping the space bar to get these things out. Yeah. Yep. Master detail relationships, it's not a problem for us at all. In fact, we help guide you through all of that. And validation rules, conditional formatting rules, all of that's there. We built it to be web native. So we're not that fond of code behind, but we love code just slightly behind, or code in front, maybe might be the way to describe it. You can
code
embed
around the corner?
Yeah, something like that. Basically, rather than C# code buried deep inside the form, we allow you to put some JavaScript in there right below the surface, so that you can have, if we didn't do it, you can add it, although we probably did it. Yeah. So you can do it, but we would prefer for you to not have to if you don't need to.
No, but still, the fact that you use JavaScript is a big pro, I would say.
Right. We
Because if you
are
talk about
embracing.
InfoPath,
Yeah.
you will have to teach someone XPath, for instance.
Oh yeah, no, you don't need to do that with us. And
No.
anytime that you might need to do any sort of XML-based queries in order to do filtering on SharePoint, we'll speak XML to SharePoint, but we'll speak a nice convenient web page expression builder to you. So basically, it doesn't suck.
Okay.
In fact, I believe the next slide gives me the opportunity to share out my screen and show you what we're doing.
Yep, I stopped sharing, so you can take over.
So I will, this is a skybow form, but rather than show you the design environment, why don't I just open this? And hopefully you will notice that this looks an awful lot like the form that Erwin just analyzed a moment ago. So this is an employee registration form filled out, and we've got information on location and skills and attached documents. There are a couple of things that make this a bit more fun, not the least of which is, I mean, skills, that's an attached child list that's automatically linked to this without you having to write any link logic. We do that. The attached documents, I don't really have any here, but they are, it's not just standard attachments. We can link a document library to a list item and then allow you to do full uploads and previewing and journal and versioning and everything else on things that behave as if they were attachments to documents. So it's actually a step up from what's in the box. But yeah, the takeaway from this is this looks a whole lot, almost identical to what Erwin was showing you before. And this is Skybow's Solution Studio, where we build the whole thing. Now, one thing I'd like you to notice is that when you're building a rich form, it's basically like building a web part on a SharePoint page. In fact, we mix the form experience in with the page design experience, and you've got access to literally everything. We know we're a part of SharePoint. We embrace that we are a part of SharePoint, and therefore go ahead and do SharePoint-y things and form-y things at the exact same time. But in this particular case, I'm not making use of tabs, but I am making use of two master detail relationships. I've got cascading drop-downs here. So this is the location of country. This is the state. That's the city. All I needed to do in order to provide that was to add a little bit of filtering criteria to indicate that, for example, this is the city. So the city's state should equal the selected state inside of that form, and then we save. Now that's XML. It's being sent back to SharePoint in order to retrieve only the qualifying items here. But
it always gives me a bit warm feelings when I see a good old camel query.
But yeah, calculated values for sublist columns, the status of the control itself, any action that you want to take when the form loads or when someone does something, it's all there. And in terms of the types of controls, look, fields and grouping and tables and tabs and rich text boxes and custom buttons, sublists and sublibraries, it's all there. It just works, and it's done in a very HTML friendly and very SharePoint friendly fashion. The forms are extremely powerful. We like to say no code, no compromise. In truth, there's a place to put code when you want to use it, but you don't need to. You rarely need to, but you can when you want to, because consultants in particular like to go beyond. And that's a happy thing. The other thing I wanted to show you is, well, let's see. I'm showing you the form design window, but the other thing we do at Skybow is it's not only about the forms. So what we have here is the schema designer. We refer to one list with lots of sublists as a dossier, sort of a collection of linked lists. But from one place, you can get to all the forms and all the view definitions of both the the master list and all the detail lists, and lists that are used as lookups or just lists for other purposes. You can edit pages, you can add images and navigation elements, and essentially all of this can be done to build the whole solution, including actions, which can contain a whole chain of events. Basically, when you click on that button or click on that link in the quick navigation bar or anything else, you can have a whole set of things take place. Some of which are interactive, talking to the user or getting things from the user, and some of which happen in the background.
Yep. There's a couple of questions actually related to your product here.
Oh, okay.
Jeremy asks if this is Flow compatible.
Actually, there is absolutely, yes, you can use this hand in hand with Flow. This does not fight Flow. In fact, it likes Flow very much. Flow is usually designed to react to something that's been done, and we do things. So we can cause an update to happen to a list or a deletion of an item in a list, or we can't do a flow on a deletion, but certainly we can cause a new item or another item to exist, in which case, yes, we can trigger flows. In fact, our packaging, this is the other thing I was going to say, is these are all sorts of assets for building the entire app or the whole solution. Well, we can package them into something that can then in turn be published to other locations. So full-blown application lifecycle management. If this is just forms, that's fine. But if it's forms and list content and the actual data, all of it's there and all of it's deployable over and over again. You can deploy, I'm building in the cloud, but I can deploy to on-premises, and I don't need a live connection to do it. I can save this as a package and then deploy it from a USB stick. There are lots of options here. But the Flow guys have done some work to make their flows exportable and importable. And so we're actually looking at the ability to include exported flow definitions into our solution packages to make them work happily with Flow. Okay. That doesn't exist today, but our architecture permits it, and we are really keen on making that work.
Are the forms multilingual?
Yeah, actually it is. Remember, we're building native SharePoint forms. Our forms are HTML web parts living inside of SharePoint web part pages. So we're multilingual in the same way that SharePoint is. So if these are field definitions, or the names, these are display names for fields. If you have a multilingual SharePoint site, you can indicate what the field names are in multiple languages. We'll automatically adapt to that. If you're using site variations, we can work with that. We can also create many forms, not just the standard ones. So we could create a whole set of custom display forms for different contexts, or different edit forms for different contexts or different languages, or so on. So you can do it the way SharePoint does it, or you can get fancy. We'll give you both choices.
Okay, there's still, I know there's more questions, but there's a Q&A section where we'll go through them.
Those are the two that made the most sense to answer on the fly.
In this context right now.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Yeah.
No, I appreciate you doing that.
Yep.
I could keep going, much like Erwin could. We like our product, but I think you've seen what you needed to see. So let me stop sharing. Erwin's got the slide deck, and pass control back, because we've got a little bit more to talk about. In fact, the next slide would be reason number 10.
Exactly.
Which is, and I kind of made this point already, skybow rich forms are web parts in SharePoint pages. Skybow solutions are made up out of SharePoint assets. So there's no external runtime engine where we build something that lives in our world and we talk back and forth to SharePoint. We just don't do that. We actually create SharePoint assets, and SharePoint runs your app, and that means it's fast. It also means that it's HTML based. It's extremely well behaved. You might want to hit a couple of buttons, or a couple, yeah, there we go. It's very well behaved. You have access to the full SharePoint context within the form. including who the user is, which SharePoint groups and Active Directory groups they belong to. You know things about the current site, you know things about the current subsites, you know things about the current farm, and all of that information is available within forms, within actions, within all kinds of things. So there's no, you're not communicating with SharePoint through a tunnel. You're actually in SharePoint when the form is running. It makes for a nicely, tightly coupled experience.
So is it, because it's HTML based, is it responsive?
It will be later this year,
Okay.
where there are two options. There's classic forms that are responsive, and the thing that will release several months from now is full support for modern pages and modern sites.
Okay.
Those will inherently be responsive.
Right.
But there are ways to make using a couple of style sheet techniques, there's a way to make our stuff responsive right now.
Okay.
But a classic SharePoint page is not inherently responsive, so you kind of need to accept certain compromises, but you can totally make it work. We have customers that are doing it now.
Good. The question here from Danny is, does it work on modern pages?
It will later this year.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, we're not doing modern stuff. Is we actually have stuff we're testing in alpha right now. Beta will be soon, or release to the web will happen later this year.
Right.
So yes, it is happening, but you can't. It's not, in all fairness and all honesty, no, it's not for modern pages or modern sites.
Okay.
Right this second.
I always have a little thing with the word modern, because we can't keep it calling modern until the end of days.
In 2 years, it's not going to be modern at all. In fact, in 1 year, it's not going to be modern.
No, exactly. So, yeah, I usually prefer
the SharePoint framework-based user interface.
Exactly.
Yes, we are actually adapting to that right now. In fact, everything we've done makes it not too painful to make that work. There's just a lot of testing that has to happen.
Right. Right. So let's go to the Q&A.
Yeah, but in conclusion, you've seen 10 reasons. First 5 are reasons to stop using InfoPath, and the second 5 were reasons that it's okay to consider something other than InfoPath now, because there is a forward migration story, and the place that you can migrate to is actually very nice. So get away from something that's a ticking time bomb and move to something that actually is rich and productive, and you've got tools that will help you get there, rather than the advice up until today, which was stop using the old stuff and rebuild everything yourself.
Yep. Great.
So let's look at your questions.
Yeah, exactly.
There's several.
Alexi has a question here. What are the on-prem replacements to look at where server-side validation is required? Because modern alternatives are vulnerable to tampering with disabled control values.
Well, if that question is specific to Skybow, I can tell you how we deal with it. But there are more generic, or there are more platform neutral answers to that too. So Erwin and I can both answer this question. In the case of Skybow, it depends on the nature of the validation and the nature of the background processing. We actually have the ability to, if you grant us permission to do that, we can do automatic calculation of totals and averages and sums and counts and all that kind of stuff in the background at the data level, so you don't have to have the form do that work. And that will happen in a very well-behaved, secured way. Similarly, inheriting metadata, taking master properties and pushing those values down in an automated fashion into the child detail list items and documents and so on, so that they've got, if you look at it, you can see the context, even if you're looking at a detail list item all by itself or looking at a document all by itself. We do all of that, but we would do it outside of the form so that intercepting form requests actually isn't really a thing.
No. Exactly.
So we try to bypass the problem. But if you're talking about checking to see if values within a certain range before attempting to save the form data, the typical things are, well, hopefully everything is in HTTPS. I know that's just the beginning of the security stack, but let's make sure we've covered that. And the ability to validate that the client is the client. But at that point, the advice is not specific to SharePoint or even skybow. It's just coding practices. And Erwin, you probably have some ideas on this.
No, also for time's sake, we're running
out
of time. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
But suffice to say, validation that the user is who the user is, and validation that the communication channel is protected. What you're describing is a problem that every web page has.
Yes.
And there are web-friendly ways of addressing that problem.
So there's a question that I can answer, and the question is from Kyle, and he asks, can the product take, and I assume he means transformator here, take the InfoPath form and convert it to a Power App with JavaScript? No, currently not, but we are looking into that.
Yeah, the models are very different. The thing that makes it so friendly to skybow is that an InfoPath form bound to a SharePoint list is basically a very SharePoint-y thing. We are SharePoint forms, and so it maps one-to-one very, very nicely. Power Apps are a completely different type of technology that works in a completely different type of way. It's possible, I suppose, but it's going to take a lot more work to take Transformator and generate a Power App than it is to generate a skybow-rich form.
Yeah. So Jeremy asks a question for you, Mike. Are there rules like in InfoPath?
Yes.
Yeah.
The rules in question are JavaScript based. They're either builder based because we give you a dialogue for them. So, but virtually everywhere that you would want a rule, we can do a JavaScript formula. And you might not realize you're using JavaScript because it's usually go to the side and drag and drop a field value, and then pick an expression operator like equals or not equals or something like that, and then choose something else. So it is a JavaScript expression, but you might be able to just generate it with clicks.
Right. Okay. So,
but yeah, totally.
Continuing with Jeremy, he also asks if there is an option for external data connections.
At the moment, skybow does external data two ways, either through SharePoint external lists or through OData calls or JSON calls.
Right.
So,
okay. So as long as there's no data interface to your data, you're good, effectively.
Yeah.
Yep.
And if the data in question is a method as opposed to a data source, then we can bring back just a block of JSON.
Right. Nick asks, how do the relationships that you talked about in your form work when working with large lists? And I mean lists, I assume that Nick means lists that run beyond the 5,000 throttling limit.
Yep. Well, remember, large lists are just fine as long as you're retrieving a subset at a time. Yep. SharePoint's happy with, has always been, well, been happy for a very long time with large lists as long as you're not retrieving the whole list at once. So in our particular case, if you're bringing up linked or a dossier, as it is called, a master list item with a whole bunch of detail content, the odds of what's being retrieved being large is next to zero. It's non-zero, but it's really low. And when it is, you're creating standard SharePoint lookup relationships between lists. Those cause indexes to be created. It'll be fine.
Right. Okay. So Ryan has a couple of questions here that I would like to address. He asks, what is the difference between SharePoint Transformator and skybow rich forms? I can easily, or hopefully easily explain that. Transformator is a tool that analyzes your farm and visualizes the information that we found on your farm. There is a part that I did not demo today, but we do also transform parts. So we do actually generate, for instance, we find content types and we generate the CSOM or the JavaScript code or the PowerShell code, whatever language you actually prefer that's currently supported by SharePoint, to actually create that content type in Office 365 or on a client-side approach. So it does that for all the declarative artifacts, content types, lists, fields, features, etc., etc., etc. So that is the transformator part, but of transform part of transformator. But a big part of transformator is the assessment, is to figuring out what is actually happening on your farm. You might be surprised how many workflows you run, how many InfoPath forms you have, how many content types you actually have provisioned to your farm that are actually not being used at all. You might still want to.
You guys tend to refer to all this stuff as customizations. I prefer the term application assets. But it doesn't matter what you call it. Rencore is excellent, in fact, uniquely excellent at being able to tell you what you've done to your SharePoint environment.
Exactly.
No matter what you want to call things.
That's our goal.
And then Skybow is a low-code, no-code solution building environment for SharePoint solutions. So things that you build with Skybow are the kinds of things that Rencore can audit and evaluate. In fact, we've done that lots of times. And then that's the relationship between the companies and the products. So we're technology partners. We occasionally do marketing efforts together, and actually our principals and worker bees are friends with each other. But we are two separate companies. Rencore's in the application maintenance or application governance business. We're in the application building business.
Yep. That's and the relationship. Yeah, we're just two.
We're two companies that are good friends.
Yeah, exactly. We like each other. Yep.
Yeah.
Does Skybow Rich Forms work with Workflow Manager?
Sure. I mean, it's a Skybow Rich Form works with SharePoint content. You can use a Workflow Manager workflow on that content. You could also use Flow. You could also, at least on premises, or actually even in the cloud, use the classic, Windows Workflow Foundation 3.5 workflow there too. We love everybody, or more to the point, we're working with SharePoint, and SharePoint is happy to work with all three workflow models.
There's actually many more questions, so we'll unfortunately will not be able to answer all of them. What we'll try to do is that we will share the questions, will be shared between me and Mike, and we'll try to answer them offline. And because when you're signed up, we have your contact information, and we'll try to get back to you within a reasonable time.
I see one quickly answerable question here from Basanta about future proofing. Like in other words, how can we ensure that Skybow will not go the InfoPath route? All I can tell you is we expect to be in business for a really long time. We've been in business for quite a while, and we don't think that's going to change. And in terms of are we likely to create a new form environment and make it impossible to migrate or upgrade from there? The answer is no. We've already done this once. We had an earlier forms technology, and we allow you to move from that to today's Skybow Rich Forms. As we do things for modern forms, there will be a way to take a classic form and turn it into a modern style or an SPFX-based form, or to make it render both ways depending on where you put it. We are actually highly committed to forward migration paths no matter what we do. So the odds of us, we're in the application building tools business, and there's not another secret group within Skybow that's going to compete with us and say we've got a better idea, so you guys go off and go to sleep now. It's just us. So anything we build that's new, there will be a migration path. So we will not be InfoPathed.
That's good to hear. For Ryan, and maybe that's the last question we do for today, is like, do we need to upgrade existing InfoPath forms to Skybow forms for existing forms? And my recommendation is yes.
Yeah, you probably, once you migrate it. Yeah, the very first thing you're going to see, we're working on the migration stuff right now. And the very first thing that we'll support, Rencore and Skybow, is the form layout and the form bindings and all of that. So the first thing is your forms that don't have a lot of rules in them or any code behind. We should be able to migrate those very, very quickly. The second thing that will come a few months after that is support for rules. We'll take your InfoPath rules and turn them into the JavaScript-based rules that we use in Skybow Rich Forms. Code behind is the third phase, and I don't know if we'll even attempt that. Based on what we learned from Rencore analyzing a lot of customer sites to see to the extent to which people are actually using code behind, we'll look at that and then make a judgment call to see, because it's a lot of effort, to see whether there's a payoff for it. But we're definitely doing layouts first and then rules in phase 2.
Great. So we're actually already 1 minute past 5 o'clock.
Are we in trouble?
We're not necessarily, but
just checking.
We're not necessarily in trouble, but I still want to thank you for today, Mike.
I want to thank you for hosting the webinar. It's been a pleasure doing it, and I love the questions you're getting. You guys are on the ball. I really, it's great.
Really interesting to see the questions. So as I said earlier, we'll try to answer your questions by means of sending you an email. This has been recorded. We'll share the recording also with you. You will all receive an email with a link so you can watch this webinar again. Thank you for being here today, for spending the time with us, and I hope you have a great day.
As do I.
Goodbye.